The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, can the provinces work together to offset Donald Trump's tariff threat? Then, is Canada prepared to assert its sovereignty in the Arctic? That's all next on the agenda. February 1st is the day Donald Trump declared the U.S. will impose import tariffs on Canadian products. In the meantime, leaders at the federal and provincial level have been debating responses to those tariffs. One idea that has cropped up again, and it's by no means a new one, bringing down inter-provincial trade barriers. Why do they still exist? And what could easing them mean for the Canadian economy? For their thoughts, let's welcome, in the nation's capital, Jeffrey Simpson. For more than 3 decades, national affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. He's also the author of 8 books. And here in studio, Ryan Minucha, research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and the author of Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups, Canada's Quest for Inter-Provincial Free Trade. And Ryan Mallow, Vice President, Legislative Affairs Ontario and VP Communications for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And as I welcome everyone to the program, we have to say off the top, the producer of this segment, Mike Attenborough, clearly has a sense of humor because he's got 2 guests here in Toronto, both named Ryan, both of the last names starting with M. Last names sound very similar. And just to rub it in, he's booked Jeffrey Simpson to be on the show from Ottawa. And Jeffrey and I saw each other at the Leafs-Senators game this past Saturday night where the Senators defeated the Maple Leafs. And I guess I wasn't quick enough to veto your appearance on this program today. And you're no doubt feeling a little extra bounce in your step, Mr. Simpson, which you're not entitled to, but there we go. Anyway, welcome everybody. Great to have you here. Jeffrey, let me start with you. 30 plus years covering these issues for the Globe and Mail. How many times has this issue cropped up over the years?
How many lights are there on Yonge Street? I've lost track. Look, I used to go in the first half of my columnist career to the inter-provincial premiers conferences in the summer. They were always in a nice place, so it was hardly a hardship assignment. And the communiques at the end would have this. Premier A from, let's say, Atlantic Canada was griping about the fisheries and what Ottawa wasn't doing. And Premier B from Saskatchewan wasn't happy with the way Ottawa was handling the grain industry, et cetera. So it was a list of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And I finally stopped going. I said, this is a complete waste of time. They don't talk about interprovincial issues, qua interprovincial issues, such as, and one could go through a long list that have been provided over the years by think tanks such as the ones for which the Ryans work, or international or national business associations, academics, think tanks. Episodically, the federal government would say, wag its finger and say, we really do something about this. Just doesn't happen. Too many vested interests, too many established ways of doing things. No votes in it, I guess. One last point. Our Supreme Court has not been helpful. One of the reasons, there are many, many, why the U.S. economy is very strong is because there the Supreme Court has had rulings, plural, reinforcing the Interstate Commerce Clause, preventing Georgia from doing something that would impede trade with Tennessee or Texas. Our Supreme Court, going back to before there was a Supreme Court, back when the British High Courts ruled, has usually favored provinces. In the most recent case, involving taking liquor over the board from New Brunswick to Quebec, the court ruled, yes, you could put infringements on that because provinces are responsible for health and public safety. So the court has been complicit in this failure as a country to get a grip on this problem.
Lots of good stuff there, and we're going to deep dive on all of those points that Jeffrey made through the course of our discussion. Ryan Minucha, let's get you in here. We have something in Canada called the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which is among the provinces. It's been in place since 2017. How well is it working?
Great. The CFTA 2017 is actually the replacement of the Agreement on Internal Trade from the early 90s. So we've kind of been using an internal free trade agreement for about 30 years. And the 2017 iteration, I think it was a huge mark forward in advancing. They introduced this concept it's called the RCT, where you hash out these regulatory differences that Jeffrey was alluding to. And these things are really technical and require folks to come together and hash out the subject matter experts to hash things out. And they're kind of unsexy issues when you really get into them. We're talking about the differences in what high-vis apparel is across the provinces.
Excuse me, what is?
High visibility apparel.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about the contents of first aid kits. We're talking about varying driver qualifications for long combination vehicles. But you need the folks in the room who have the domain expertise. And that's what the CFTA and its RCT are really helping out with.
Too many acronyms here, Ryan. Too many acronyms. All right. How did the lives of your members get better as a result of these agreements?
So I think it's still very much a work in progress. Like Ryan mentioned things like first aid kits. Before the most recent internal trade agreement, you had rules where every province had different requirements for what is in a first aid kit. So if you were producing first aid kits as a company and you were selling to Quebec, it had different requirements than Ontario, than Alberta, than BC, and it started to make very little sense to produce for 10 provinces. You're just kind of going to produce for one and stay in your backyard. So in recognizing sort of across the board, like, the kits that apply in BC should be able to apply to Ontario, that sort of thing makes life easier. As good as as much progress as the agreement has made, though, there are still a lot of barriers that remain very frustrating, in particular credential and certification recognition, getting labor to move across borders. While we recognize that, a plumber in Quebec can be a plumber in Ontario, there's still licensing requirements, there's still some fees that are there, there's still paperwork that needs to be filled out, and that's still really slowing things down.
Does it, Jeffrey, by your eye, I mean, you pointed out at the top of your last answer, this seems to sort of rear its ugly head over and over and over and over. How can we expect to have free trade with other countries when we can't seem to figure it out within our own borders?
Well, the last Ryan who spoke put his finger on something in my part of the world in Ottawa. If you go across into, on this side of the border, you see lots of Quebec companies building things, developers. You see people, Quebec plumbers, Quebec electricians. You go on the other side of the border, which I do often, you don't see any Ontario companies because there are restrictions in Quebec that prevent that. So that's a wonderful little tiny microcosmic illustration. The kinds of things the Ryans are talking about are useful, but there are a lot bigger things that could be done. For example, it has been suggested that we need one national securities regulator. Well, Manitoba wants one because they've got some insurance industries, and BC wants one because they have mining, and Quebec wants it because it's Quebec, and they are all afraid that Toronto would suck it all up. Here's another idea. Drug costs, okay? At the moment, every province has its own drug formulary, and it negotiates with the big companies for the best price it can get. These are all hidden, by the way. But if the provinces all got together and said, no, we're going to have one negotiator for us, let's say 2 provinces negotiate on all of our behalves, you'd be negotiating on behalf of 40 million people instead of 9 or 10 in Ontario and whatever is in Saskatchewan. So there's lots of those big things that could be done that would actually save money and efficiency. But the provinces are too determined to hold on to the jurisdiction that they have and not share it even with other provinces to the detriment of the whole country. And it is very ironic, I think, that Donald Trump, who's disliked by 75% of Canadians, according to the polls, that was before he threatened the tariffs. It's probably 80 or 85% now. We can thank him for once again focusing attention on this issue that has only in the past received intermittent attention and minor adjustments.
Ryan Minucha, let's do an example here of something I think I remember from your book. Wasn't it the case once upon a time that if you wanted to sell beer in a particular province, you actually had to make it in that province? And then they finally figured out a way where you actually could have more liberalized trade of beer province to province without necessarily making it there. So they somehow managed to figure out how to do that. What was the magic elixir that allowed that to happen?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that the inter-provincial trade story in Canada has been quite dynamic and has evolved over time. And, folks, if we're looking at it in a snapshot of the past 10, 20, 30 years, we can get frustrated because we see episodes like that. But if we look at the dawn of Confederation, we had varying weights and stamps. We had different postage systems, different currencies that were acceptable in provinces. We had border agents at the border of Upper and Lower Canada monitoring the passage of goods. And yes, we're kind of stuck with a little bit with the Comeau decision, with the the beer, the gentleman going across the border into New Brunswick, coming back into Quebec. But even if we're frustrated with that decision, we did make incremental gain. I do want to say that we have been making progress. And yes, when Cuomo did that, the politicians rallied around and they lifted the cap on how many beers you can bring back into the province. So there is political will to do something. This was the nation of building the Trans-Canada Highway. That was far harder than, lifting the restrictions on long combination truck drivers.
This Ryan's glass is clearly half full. How about yours?
I don't disagree, but it seems like we never go the whole way. Like the Como example is a good one. And I was a student at the University of Ottawa. It was not an uncommon thing to walk across the bridge into Gatineau, grab a case of beer and walk back. That was only legal in Ontario in, I believe, 2019, 2020, and you still can't have it delivered to you. Right? It's 2025 and we can't do delivery. You can physically go, but delivery is a hang-up because we've got the LCBO and the various other liquor authorities. And as Jeffrey alluded to, the provinces tend to put their barriers up. So I think there's a lot of progress in the story, but in 2025 that we're still talking about it is just immensely frustrating. And you get a lot of business owners, I think a lot of Canadians going, why?
Well, we actually have, in the Justin Trudeau cabinet, a minister for internal trade. That's Anita Anand. And here's what she's had to say about all this. Here's the comment, and Sheldon, bring this up. I'll read it for those listening on podcast. Enhancing internal trade and removing barriers will be a key tool to ignite the domestic economy, enhance foreign investment, and counter the impact of potential tariffs. We said to Canadians that we would be ready and that we would fight for Canadian interests, and we are. And further, she made some other comments in a recent interview about the potential economic benefits of removing or easing trade barriers. Let's hear from Minister Anand. Sheldon, if you would.
It's estimated that removing these internal trade barriers could lower prices by up to 15%, boost productivity by up to 7%, and add up to $200 billion to the domestic economy.
Jeffrey, at the risk of beating a dead horse here, if that upside is so obvious, why doesn't this happen?
Well, I agree with what the Ryans have said. We've been making what I would call minimal or incremental progress over the last 10 or so years. But she's talking about a much, much bigger leap. And because of the internal barriers that already exist and the interest groups that stand behind those barriers, it's going to take quite a long time before a number of them are diluted or eliminated entirely. This is not something one can do very quickly. We've been talking about products. Let me give you some other examples. Provinces have often been very reluctant to allow certain major national projects. I give you a classic example. Every day when the river is open, large freighters come down, tankers I should say, the St. Lawrence River to deliver oil to the refineries in the east end of Montreal. Okay, come from the Middle East, wherever. But Quebec wouldn't allow the Canada East pipeline to send Alberta oil to Quebec, through Quebec into Atlantic Canada, where it could be shipped offshore. Now you tell me why oil is more dangerous in a pipeline, environmentally speaking, than it is in freighters or tankers coming down the St. Lawrence. Now, is that an interprovincial trade barrier? Yeah. It's not a regulation. It's just a decision that the Quebec government has made pursuant to the sense of public opinion, but it's contrary to the national interest and also, I think, to Quebec's interest, but I say that as an outsider.
Ryan Milo, how does that story that Jeffrey Simpson just told make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think largely when you're, a Canadian citizen, it doesn't. And it's frustrating to hear that these are the kind of things that pop up. But I think, too, that's part of why pinning down interprovincial trade and the barriers have been so difficult. I mean, you'll hear, the alcohol example comes up very often because it's easy to understand. Provincial meat inspection, you can't pass meat that's between borders that's provincially inspected, has to be federally inspected. Lloydminster is the one city in all of Canada where that rule has only now just been gotten rid of after a lengthy pilot to make sure that meat traveling across the street was in fact okay. And I think it comes back to the, in a crisis like we have with the Trump tariffs, there's a big Team Canada approach, and you hear the premiers, generally speaking, on board with it. There's always a little bit of division. When we don't have that external threat, though, that protectionism comes right back very quickly. And I think that's always been the frustration is it's a focus when it's a focus, and then we've got 900 other things to ask for. We're going to move on to that, and we don't actually get that thing done.
Which province, if there is one, is the worst in terms of perpetuating these internal trade barriers?
So I think, generally speaking, it's our friends in Quebec. They have the most exceptions to the Canada Free Trade Agreement. I think it's 36. 37, somewhere in there. And again, some of that is language oriented, but I will say that one of the things that has been lacking for a long time is a true champion among the premiers. I think we had that a little bit in Jason Kenney. He was starting to make moves in Alberta where he didn't need everyone else to move. He said, we're going to get rid of our barriers. You should get rid of yours too, but that doesn't mean we can't do anything. But since he left, we've been lacking that person. Premier Ford seems to be stepping up during the tariff negotiations. Maybe he's that guy. But that's what we really need is someone motivated to get it done, and that's what we've traditionally lacked.
How, I mean, you're the glass half full guy, so I'll ask you, how do premiers come together to negotiate these things in the first place? Is that happening at all right now?
Absolutely. They're coming together right now, and I think three things. One is, if I were them right now, what I would do is I would change, we have an internal trade court where you can launch trade claims against other governments. And I think you let the market discipline each of the other provinces for violating the tenets of liberalized trade under the free trade agreement. I think that's what I would do. Make it easier for small and medium-sized businesses who are impacted the most. So if I'm rallying around that table, that's what I'm pushing for. And I think they should be looking to unlock, I need to put the outer bound at $200 billion. If they can come up with an intergovernmental prosperity commission that finds $50 billion in savings over the next 2 years, kind of like what we saw south of the border with Doge, that would be incredible. What a story. What a win. We identify, unlock, and actually advance. And we know a lot of these early issues, and if we open up the trade court, we are flagged even more by, the inboxes are flooded for those who study this. We hear a lot about this, and just being able to push the envelope on so many fronts would be incredible.
Jeffrey, based on your experience of watching either provinces work with each other or not, or the federal government lead or not, what do you think it's going to take to, I don't know, can the provinces do this on their own? Do they need the federal government to lead them through this process? How do you see it?
Well, you need Donald Trump. You need the fear of God, or I won't say God, the fear of Trump, let's put it that way. And that's why at the moment we have this discussion that is rekindled with a brighter flame than in the past. And good. And we'll see where it leads. I like very much what Ryan just said about a trade tribunal or court, because as I said, if these matters have to go to the Supreme Court takes years before it hears a case, and then it takes a long time to render a decision. And as I say, its pattern is not an encouraging one in this area. So I think that would be a real step forward. But I want to just repeat, it's not just a question, these are important, of regulations, for trucking and all these things. That's extremely important. But there are big national projects that go across borders. You ask what the federal government can do. I always thought that a political party in an election campaign, a federal election campaign, you have to be careful how you phrase this, should say, we stand ready as the government of Canada to assist provinces that want to build inter-provincial links. I'm thinking in particular of hydro links, of oil and gas links. We stand ready. We can't force you to do this, but it's in the national interest and yours. And by standing ready, that means money. That means technical help if that's required. So that you have a national government that wants to enjoin the provinces, work with the provinces to build these large national projects. We just saw two provinces, to be fair, resolve a long-standing problem between Newfoundland and Quebec.
Yes.
Newfoundland signed a deal years ago. I won't go into the details. They got the short end of the stick. They've been complaining about it ever since. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not rule in their favor. But now they've got an agreement with Quebec that when the terribly injurious contract that has hurt Newfoundland so much ends, they are going to have a new agreement which will be much fairer to Newfoundland and Quebec. And that's a wonderful sign of two provinces getting together and doing good things after a long period of substantial irritation.
Now that is a great example, plucked from the headlines from not too long ago. It's an example of the Federation working, which we don't see enough of. Ryan Mallow, is there any other obvious call it what you want, low-hanging fruit, deal in the making, deal in the offing that you see out there right now?
So I think there's some low-hanging fruit that we're seeing that's in progress, and then there's sort of the big home run ball that I want to say is low-hanging fruit because I really want the government to do it and approach it. And it comes off of what we're seeing right now is 8 of the 10 provinces and a couple of the territories are involved in a mutual recognition pilot in the trucking industry. We heard that a little bit earlier, that there are rules around trucking where like the wide load signage between Alberta and Saskatchewan has to change. You'd literally have a trucker stopping on the side of the highway, getting out of his vehicle, switching the sign and getting back in. The driving requirements, tonnage, that sort of thing. So 8 out of 10 provinces, I believe it's BC and Quebec that are the holdouts. BC because they had election, Quebec because they traditionally have been a holdout. But we're very excited because the principle of mutual recognition, I think, is the real low-hanging fruit. I think a lot of times when we talk about rules and things between government, the word harmonization gets thrown around a lot. And what we see in harmonization is we tend to go to the highest standard. There's a lot of negotiation. It gets very ticky-tack. If we can do mutual recognition and say, hey, working at heights training on a tower in Winnipeg isn't really that different than working at heights in a tower in Toronto. That construction worker should be able to come over and not need to retake the training or get recertified. We can just get them to work. That would be massive progress. So that's really what we're looking for with Minister Anand's leadership too, is let's get the mutual recognition ball rolling and just say, hey, if it's good enough in Manitoba, if it's good enough in Alberta, it's good enough in Ontario and Nova Scotia too.
Do you see any other obvious wins out there?
We should take the Australia model for the movement of labor. It's not just goods, as Jeffrey has said. It's about people. If you can take your labor elsewhere, there's a bit of a freedom there. So I think if you move over to another province with, your certifications, it should be 30 days for you to find out that you can't practice your craft. That's what Australia did in the 90s. They've known it long ago. It's practiced in the EU. Let's take that mutual recognition concept for labor and implement it and just see that liberalization for people.
And again, we have a province that does this under Jason Kenney, Alberta. Alberta said, hey, if you're going to come to Alberta, we're going to tell our colleges, our regulatory authorities, that person comes in, they're signing up for their registration, you have 20 days to get back to them. Let them know so that they can get going to work. We saw during the pandemic as well with Ontario, we passed as of right legislation so that nurses do not need to wait to get their paper in order with the college. They can start practicing immediately so that we can get the help in hospitals we need as their paperwork is getting sorted out, because they've already been recognized in another province. So there are some smaller examples, but we've shown we can get it done. Let's get it done big and broad.
Jeffrey, let me get you to amplify on an example you gave earlier. We talked about a national securities regulator. At the moment, they seem to be province by province by province by province. I remember Jim Flaherty, when he was Minister of Finance, talking about trying to bring this in. That's many years ago already. What would be the advantage of having a single national securities regulator as opposed to the checkerboard provincial of types we have now?
It's just more efficient for companies that want to list their companies on the exchange and raise money, et cetera. It's less paperwork, less bureaucracy, easier for private investors all around. I mean, you look at the United States, they don't have a market in Los Angeles and Chicago. They've got a big one in New York. And we, who are a much smaller country, I don't think this will ever happen. Quebec will never. There is if I can put this, there is a bit of an underlying sentiment in interprovincial affairs in some areas where Ontario has always been in the forefront of making the arguments in favor of this. And the other provinces sense that they're doing it because they're the biggest province and that they would somehow gain disproportionately. And this has been very present in the attitudes of Quebec. There's a whole other set of reasons why. So there's always been a kind of unspoken underlying sense that if we did this, the principal beneficiary would be the largest province. I just end by saying there's a cliche, like all cliches, it contains an element of truth, that from crisis comes opportunity. And if we are hit with 25% tariffs, that's like 2 slaps in the face. And if we don't wake up and realize that we've got to deal with our own internal economy, not that it's going to be a complete antidote to what Trump intends to do, because it'll take a fair bit of time. And even if we accomplish a number of objectives here, we can't lose sight of the fact that we're going to be penalized here and with our tariffs in the U.S. market. This is a tipping point for us, because since the last years of Pierre Trudeau's government, when they were thrashing around trying to find out what to do, they began to talk about sectoral free trade with the United States. And ever since then, our political leaders and our businesses have been turning more and more of their attention to the U.S. market and preaching the virtues of North American integration. Mr. Trump doesn't believe in that. So if we keep assuming that the future will be like the past, we're completely misreading the man who's in the White House.
Ryan Mnuchin, is it possible that through Trump's bullying of this country right now, something positive in terms of our own interprovincial trade barriers could benefit?
100%, and we just need to look to our history. So in our Constitution, we have what we call the Free Trade Clause. That came out in 1867. Why did that come into our Constitution? Because the Fathers of Confederation, who were 50, 55 years old, had twice in the past 25 years at that point, had their economic worlds upended. Once by the Brits in the 1840s when they canceled some imperial preferences, and once by the U.S. when they canceled the U.S.-Canada, an early U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in 1866. In response, one of the catalysts was for that free trade clause that we now get to rely on, and Cuomo tried to rely on in his case for beer in Quebec. Like, it takes these external moments for us to get our house in order, and I think this is another episode where we're seeing that take place, and we have a brief window for our leadership to overcome their differences and break out of these provincial fiefdoms of regulation and legislation that protects domestic entities. One chance to really kind of do this in, a very 10-year, 20-year cadence, and this is it.
Ryan Mallow, in our last minute here, do you see this moment as being the moment for striking?
Absolutely. It is, again, as Jeffrey said, in crisis, there's opportunity. You wish you didn't need to get to the crisis to take it. This has always been the right thing to do and a good idea. But if all eyes are on it now, if the premiers are in order, even Premier Legault is talking about it in Quebec, let's get it done.
You're sounding a lot like a certain premier of a certain big province when you keep saying, get it done, get it done.
It's a good mantra.
Well, we're about to go into a writ period here now, right? So I got to have equal time. We've got to, you want to use some Liberal or NDP expressions as well?
Honestly, I think that this is going to be a piece of the election too. I mean, the trade is going to be a big part of it. The tariffs are going to be a big part of it. I'm hoping we see all parties in Ontario get on board because, again, it's a good idea. It always has been. Let's follow through.
We shall see. Let's follow through is a little more nonpartisan. There we go. Mr. Director, can I have a three-shot of our guest? There we go. Thank you very much. From right to left, Jeffrey Simpson, the author and journalist joining us from the nation's capital. Ryan Mallow from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business in the middle. Ryan Mnuchin, C.D. Howe Institute and author. We thank the three of you for coming on a TVO tonight and making sexy one of the least sexiest topics out there. For many decades, not much changed in Canada's Arctic, but now climate change and Russia's invasion of Ukraine are transforming the region. The far north makes up 40% of Canada's landmass and 75% of its coastline. It's home to 150,000 people, half of whom are Indigenous. And late last year, a federal committee made 26 recommendations to improve security and economic development in the Arctic. For more on the future of sovereignty and development in the far north, we are joined on Zoom from Hay River, Northwest Territories by that territory's premier, R.J. Simpson. And in studio, P. Whitney Lackenbauer, Canada Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North at Trent University and the network lead at the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. And Elizabeth Riddell-Dixon, Professor Emerita of Political Science at Western University. And we are delighted to have you two here in our studio. And Premier Simpson, it's good of you to join us on the line from probably the furthest spot north in Canada we've ever had a guest on this program. So thank you so much for joining us. And let me put you to work right away. We want to define Arctic sovereignty. Those words, what do they mean to you?
Well, when it comes to Arctic security and Arctic sovereignty, I understand that really is the government of Canada who is responsible for that. But the way I see Arctic sovereignty, it's having a presence in the north that makes it undeniable that this is Canada. So that means having the infrastructure. It could mean having that military presence. But when you look at places like the Strait of Georgia, no one is saying that's international waters. But when you look at the Arctic, there are claims that it is international waters because we don't have that presence. And so I think having strong, vibrant communities is key to having sovereignty in the Arctic.
Maybe follow up, and then I'll get the others in on this as well. What do you think the most serious challenge is to Canada expressing its Arctic sovereignty are these days?
Well, just the cost of building in the north. We have such an infrastructure deficit in the Northwest Territories. We lack all-season roads to many communities. Our airstrips aren't the size or the material required for a lot of planes that the military might be using. We don't have the telecommunications infrastructure in place that we need. So just this general lack of infrastructure and the cost of actually building that infrastructure, especially in the face of climate change, which has just made everything much more difficult in terms of transportation and the ground itself. The permafrost is melting, and it's just becoming a much different environment.
Elizabeth, what would you add to the list of challenges as Canada tries to express its sovereignty in the far north?
Well, sovereignty is a legal concept. That means that the state, in this case Canada, has the right to form its own domestic and foreign policies without foreign interference. And so what we have to do, though, is not just make policies. We actually have to exercise that sovereignty.
Are we doing that?
Not enough. And so even in recent government documents, you see they talk about the need to do a lot more in terms of boosting up our military preparedness, but also in terms of seeing to the economic and social and cultural well-being of our people, to promote sustainable development and to protect our environment. But we have to do things in practice if we're going to retain our sovereignty. And the contrast between how we've done it and what Russia's doing it is quite enormous.
You want to follow up on that, how we're doing it versus Russia?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think as Canadians, we're often obsessed with lines on a map. When I think sovereignty, it's, as Elizabeth just said, the internationally recognized right to control activities in a given area, a given jurisdiction. I'm excited about all the things that go on within those lines. So as Premier Simpson is mentioning, it's all the acts of governance by different levels of government in Canada by Canadians within that space that makes that indisputably ours. So I think about the right for us to make decisions for ourselves, for Northerners to make decisions about what their desired future is and destiny is for themselves and for our country, the right to make sure that that's protected. So when I think about some of the pressures that we're facing all across Canada, including in the North, with interference in our democratic systems, with disinformation, misinformation, with certain dual-use activities or types of gathering by adversaries. This is the kind of stuff that to me says there's imperative that we just take more attention. So I'm perhaps not concerned that our sovereignty is going to slip away or melt away with the ice as it deteriorates. But I think we do need to show more attentiveness and make those kind of strategic investments that the Premier is alluding to.
I should get the Premier on that as well. Do you think the current government of Canada, or for that matter, any government of Canada, has adequately expressed and enforced our sovereignty in the far north?
Well, I don't want to speak to what the federal government is doing or what they're not doing in the eyes of the international community, but it's pretty clear that we do lack that type of infrastructure that was just mentioned that really displays that sovereignty to the world so that the world recognizes that the Arctic is part of Canada. And, even a couple of years ago, this might have been a bit of a moot question, but now there are questions about the Arctic and ownership and, territorial expansionist desires of certain countries. So things are changing.
How have things changed, and Premier, I'll get you to follow up on this, since the invasion by Russia of Ukraine? How's it different now?
Well, you definitely see the increased attention on the Arctic. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine probably is taking a lot of their resources, and so we're not worried necessarily about Russia coming over the North Pole into Canada. But I have noticed the attention on the North in terms of the infrastructure available, the military presence, and the resources of the North, namely critical minerals that are required for things like advanced computing, defense technology, and the like. There's a large focus on that now.
Whitney, do you see evidence that the Russians are less capable of being mischievous in the north in what we consider to be our waters since the Ukraine war?
So I wouldn't say less mischievous in our waters because I don't think that's really their prerogative. I think Russia's obsession, if we look at the Arctic through their lens, is protecting their strategic deterrence. So they have a massive amount of investment in their northern fleet based in the Arctic on the Kola Peninsula. Unlike our Arctic ports or waters, these are actually ice open all year round, and they're mainly about getting that deterrent out into the North Atlantic. So So I'm not sure that Russia has covetous designs on its Arctic. I think a lot of its focus is on us staying out of their Arctic, but they're using it as a form of leverage or pressure or coercion as part of their overall global plan. So what worries me is not that we're going to see conflict emanating from Arctic tensions or dynamics. It's actually the spillover. So what we've seen is a chill coming from Russia's brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, meaning that a lot of these governance systems that we put a lot of faith in, the Arctic Council and others, have felt the strains. So this notion that we can treat the Arctic as if it's inherently insulated from the pressures of the world, I think has really disappeared since 2022. So we are facing new questions about how do we engage with outright competitors, if not adversaries, when it's not the region itself that's going to cause the conflict, but that this competition is spilling over into it.
I'm going to pursue that more in a moment, but I need a good university professor to tell me what Arctic exceptionalism is. What does that term mean?
Arctic exceptionalism is what Whitney was referring to prior to March 22. And that was the idea that the Arctic is a region of cooperation and peaceful relations, an area that's isolated from the conflicts that are prevalent in many other parts of the world.
Has that ever been true?
Actually, it was to a large extent in terms of how they got on in the Arctic Council. Now, that was just dealing with issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. But also, if you look at all 8 Arctic countries were adhering to the international law, the Sea Convention, and so it was peaceful and orderly. But of course, after the invasion, then relations were severed with Russia, and it's sad that the Arctic Council is no longer functioning as it did. That immediately the other Arctic 7 countries said that they were going to cease operations of the Arctic Council, and then a few months later they decide, well, they would continue operations on projects that didn't involve Russia. But the Arctic Council is the premier body we have, multilateral body for negotiating Arctic cooperation, and it's also the leading organization for exemplifying how you have permanent participants or indigenous peoples right at the table participating fully in the work of the Arctic Council. So the fact that it is no longer functioning as effectively is serious.
You mentioned 8 countries, and that will come as news to some people. So we happen to have a handy map here. Sheldon, top of page 2, please. Let's bring up this map of the Arctic. It includes all the nations that border the region. So we're talking Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. And for those listening on podcast, I'll just describe what we're seeing here. There's a red line east to west goes through the map, and that is the Northwest Passage, which is obviously incredibly significant in a global context. And I'm going to get Premier Simpson to tell us why the Northwest Passage is so important to that part of the world. Go ahead.
Well, the Northwest Passage is a shortcut for shipping, essentially. There's not a lot of ways to get around North and South America, and the Northwest Passage is one of those ways to go from basically Asia to Europe in a much timelier fashion once it is passable. So right now, it's still not a journey that's easily made.
Can I ask a bit of an odd follow-up, which is, are there people in your neck of the woods that are, I don't want to say cheering on climate change, but who are understanding that if climate change becomes more serious, that's going to be an even more important part of the world because it won't freeze up part of the year, and it will be potentially be more important as a shipping channel for people who live where you do?
Yeah, I wouldn't say anybody is cheering on climate change here in the north. We are warming 4 times faster than the global average, and we're seeing the effects of that. So last year, I was evacuated. My entire town was evacuated twice for 2 months out of the year. The year before that, we were evacuated. So last year was wildfires. The year before that was floods. And we're seeing these drastic climate changes across the north, and it's impacting public safety in terms of the evacuations, and it's impacting infrastructure. So when permafrost is melting, roads aren't holding up, and we rely on that, on the permafrost. We rely on the north to be as it is. And if it changes, if we see these drastic changes, that changes a lot of how we build our infrastructure, how we maintain it, where we can build, and things like that. So I would say that there's nobody cheering on climate change up there.
No, for sure. But and out of curiosity, when you get evacuated, where does everybody go?
Well, the first time I went up to Yellowknife, so I'm on the south side of the Great Slave Lake, just about 100 kilometers north of the Alberta border. Yellowknife is 200 kilometers north of us on the north shore of the Great Slave Lake. So that was where we went in 2022 and the first evacuation in 2023. However, in August of 23, Yellowknife was evacuated as well. So we all went down to Alberta, many of us. People went to British Columbia, people went to the Yukon, people were really scattered across Canada. 70% of our population was evacuated.
Wow. Whitney, who, in your judgment, has the most legitimate claim to the Northwest Passage?
Without a doubt, it's Canada. I mean, we have a long-standing position that suggests that this is historic internal waters. It's a position that I think is very well grounded in law. We have what has to date been, I think, a respectful dispute with our key neighbor and ally, the United States, over the status of the waters. Now, they're not claiming rival ownership over the Northwest Passage. I think sometimes people get sensational ideas as if they're challenging that this is part of Canada. What they're saying is it's a directions of water or connections of salt water connecting two oceans, the Atlantic, Pacific, or Atlantic. They say there's a right for ships to have uninterrupted transit passage through those waters going through. You're not allowed to stop. You're not allowed to do anything through there. Be like the equivalent to somebody walking through your backyard and saying they have the right to pass through it. Doesn't mean they own your backyard, but they're saying that they have the right to do this. In 1988, we reached a cooperation agreement with the United States in which we agreed to put aside this legal difference and behave with respect without neither validating nor repudiating either side's legal position, that we'd cooperate in an amicable way. We've done it ever since. So I look at the Northwest Passage. I think we sometimes get caught up in our own hype that climate change also means that in the short to medium term, the northern sea route north of Russia is probably the most likely route to become more accessible. Still quite treacherous. You're still paying insurance premiums, a lot of uncertainty. It's going to ironically be followed probably by the Central Arctic Ocean. And as the Central Arctic Ocean flushes out all of that multi-year ice, because of the currents in the Arctic Ocean, a lot of that gets pushed between Canada's Arctic islands. So I'm suggesting that when we talk about the Arctic becoming more accessible, we need to be really clear. Which Arctic are we talking about? And I don't see the Northwest Passage being a major navigation route, say, replacing the Panama Canal. And especially when we have President Trump putting all that emphasis on the Panama Canal right now, I think it tells us about where it fits in the overall pecking order.
If it's so obvious, Elizabeth, that the Northwest Passage is ours, why are the Americans and the Chinese giving us such a hard time about it?
Well, I would like to say it's ours too, but there are, I mean, maybe I could just step back for 1 second, because when people ask me about the Northwest Passage, they all often conflate who owns the resources with the right of transit, which is what Whitney was talking about. There's no debate about who owns the resources. They're Canadian. Canada owns the living and the non-living resources in the Northwest Passage. The question is, under what conditions can foreign ships sail through the Northwest Passage? And as Whitney was mentioning, we have very different position from that of the United States. And I think there are weaknesses on both sides. The major problem for Canada is that the United States, the European Union, China, Japan, among some others, don't accept that this is internal waters. And if it's internal waters, we have complete sovereignty, and we can say who comes in and under what conditions. But the U.S. side also has a weakness in that it's easy to argue that there has just not been enough transit through the Northwest Passage to establish a customary norm. But sadly, time is probably not on our side, because we're having more transits. In fact, since 1990 to 2021, the number of transits tripled, and this is likely to continue. And so if we have more transits over time, especially if they don't ask Canadian consent, then one could argue that a customary norm develops. But at the moment, I completely agree with Whitney that this is not a passage that's going to be used anytime soon for a lot of transit, because there are just too many problems, too expensive, too dangerous.
Follow-up?
Yeah, quick one. I mean, Russia, I don't think, is anxious to undermine Canada's sovereignty position, because they use it as an analogy to their northern sea route, which they claim to be subject to their jurisdiction. Now, actually, our legal positions are not that similar. The Russian position is much more egregious in terms of what they're claiming and things. Same with China. They've been conspicuously silent on their statement. And when they have had research vessels, the Shui Long, sail through Canadian waters, they have gone through the permitting process. So again, there's sometimes ambiguity about what their ultimate designs are. But so far, I don't see Russia and China as primary challengers to Canada's sovereignty position as it stands. I think this is us looking at potential futures and worrying about our position and its ability to withstand those kind of challenges. But I think to date, it's largely been with the United States. And it's one, as I mentioned, that's been managed in quite an amicable way, at least to date. We maybe have some rogue actors entering onto the scene who put a lot of things into question.
All bets are off, I'm going to guess, going forward. Excuse me. Premier Simpson, in your view, what should we be doing to allay any fears that you may have about who's got sovereignty and who can control that Northwest Passage?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is really invest in the North, invest in infrastructure. And we've seen the government of Canada talk about this, their new defense strategy, the foreign policy. There's lots of talk about the North and investments in infrastructure and the need to have a presence there. There's also projects being pushed forward by the government of Nunavut for a port on the Northwest Passage, essentially, which would require some infrastructure on our end as well. So I think these are the things that we can do to really advance this. And I'll add to the conversation about the Northwest Passage. From our perspective, one of our big concerns is any environmental damage that might occur up there. So if we have ships from around the world traveling through that area and there is a spill of some sort, it's a very, very difficult place to do cleanup, to do that type of work. And the Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories still rely heavily on harvesting, whether it's whales, whether it's on land, it's caribou. There's a big connection to the North. And so part of ensuring that we have a sovereign Canada is ensuring that we can control what's happening in those waters to ensure that we avoid any sort of those environmental disasters.
But if nations continue to use the Northwest Passage without giving us, quote unquote, the heads up, is there anything we can do about it?
You know what? I think that's probably a question for the federal government. Like I said before, I'd like to see some more infrastructure in there, some more awareness. I think there's opportunities to invest in the North, better utilize the resources that are there now, like the Canadian Rangers, who really are the eyes and the ears. There's opportunities to work with my government to ensure that we're working together. There's programs in Australia, in the United States, where they do work with local Indigenous communities to help build capacity, help build that situational awareness. So there's a lot that still can be done that I just haven't seen happen to date.
You mentioned the Canadian Rangers. Whitney, you've got some experience with them, right? What is it?
Absolutely. I think I'm their biggest fan. I've been there, very privileged to be their honorary lieutenant colonel since 2014.
Why are they important to the sovereignty of our far north?
I love it. It's a very much organic Canadian solution to the question of how do you make sure you have a defense presence across a vast territory when you don't face conventional military threats. As you mentioned, Steve, we don't face the potential of a land invasion like unfortunately Ukrainians have experienced so directly. It's not the nature of the geographic place we fit in this world. So it was after the Second World War, wondering how do you make sure you do have a defense presence? And the Premier mentioned this notion of the eyes and ears of the North. Turn to people who actually reside in an area. It's their homeland. They know it intimately. They know when something's out of the ordinary. They just need to be very lightly equipped with a rifle. These days, it's not because they're going to use it for combat. That's not a scenario we're envisaging for the North. It's to be able to protect themselves against predators, think polar bears and other things that are up there, and be able to serve your communities, your territory, your nation, if you're First Nations, let's say, and your country all simultaneously. It's a wonderful Canadian success story I think we should all know more about. And if you're looking for an example of having a proportionate presence rooted in communities, as we face as Canadians, a whole bunch of different challenges, not just on the defense side of the spectrum, but all across the security and safety spectrum. It's fantastic to have these proud Canadians serving in the military in a very different way.
Yeah, they're part of the Canadian Forces, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they are reservists part-time.
The Canadian Rangers. We will remember them. Aside from the Northwest Passage, are there other areas, Elizabeth, in the far north where there is a dispute among countries for who owns what? And if so, what?
Well, I would say that an area that isn't an actual dispute, but it's the question that people ask me most, is are the Russians coming for our resources?
What's the answer?
And usually they want to say yes, but actually they're not. What they usually point to is the delineation of Russia's continental shelf. And Russia has delineated all the way across the Arctic Ocean to within 200 nautical miles, or about 370 kilometers, of our coastline and the coastline of Greenland. However, we have to say that Canada and Denmark did exactly the same thing. They delineated all the way across the Arctic Ocean to within 370 kilometers of Russia's coastline. And in doing this, all three countries are acting in accordance with international law. And so what you have, though, are huge overlaps in these delineations. But history shows us that Arctic countries negotiate and finally reach border boundaries. And the most encouraging case, I think, was the 2010 agreement between Norway and Russia, which dragged on for about 40 years. It involved important interests, petroleum products and fish, and they negotiated and finally reached an agreement. But you never had the Soviet Union or Russia, when it succeeded it, using its vastly superior military might to come in and just grab what it wanted. And so I think in this case it's going to be, at the moment, it's not propitious to talk about nice negotiations since we basically don't have contact with Russia. But down the road, I think the countries will come together and negotiate and resolve this maritime boundary dispute.
Premier, I've got to ask you about the part of the far north that has been so much in the news in the last few weeks, or certainly since Donald Trump started musing about taking over Greenland. Since you're the closest to it of the four of us here, maybe I can ask you, why do you think he's so interested in Greenland?
Well, I mean, I can't get into Donald Trump's mind.
Really?
I wish
you can't,
I wish I knew what was coming. But I think, if it's anything like here, I think there's such untapped potential in terms of the resources of the North. We have critical minerals that basically you can get from here or you can get from China. We have what is needed to power the green technology of the future, power the defense technology, and really any industrial buildup that we want to do in Canada. We need the resources of the North. And so I would expect that it's a similar situation.
If the United States controlled Greenland, which the Danes say is not going to happen, but, I don't expect Donald Trump will back off on this, at least not in the short run. What impact would that have on you and your part of Canada if that were to take place?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily impact us. We already have Alaska to the west. I think there could be impacts for Nunavut because there's a lot of familial connections between Greenland and Nunavut. So a lot of people have family members living in Greenland and in Nunavut. So I could see some issues arising there. But for us here in the territory, I guess it would be less of an issue.
Okay. Whitney, how about for you? Help us understand why Trump wants Greenland and what impact it would have on us.
So I think the Premier's just covered off the critical minerals piece. So part of what we're looking at in the West is how do we ensure that we have value chains, right from mining, exploration, mining, all the way through to making sure we have some of the ingredients to build some of those technologies, including the green transition. That's a big part of what's filling his mind. I think there's become almost a public misconception that China has a controlling interest in Greenland right now. In fact, I think the more interesting story is how Greenland, like other like-minded Arctic states outside of Russia, have actually repudiated a lot of China's designs and ambitions to get an economic foothold in our respective norths. Also, if you look at a map, Greenland's a pretty strategically important location, given that on the one hand, one side is facing us in North America, so it's pretty key to North American defense. The Americans have a major strategic base at Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Force Base. very important to U.S. national missile defense, very important to as a bomber resupply place, so really significant military infrastructure. If we go to the other side of Greenland, it's important because I was mentioning before that transit route from the Kola Peninsula in Russia, sending, say, submarines through to the North Atlantic, you're going to pass through the east coast of Greenland. So whoever controls Greenland and that east coast has a lot of opportunities for surveillance or interdiction in that space. So I'm sure that when President Trump looks at a map, he says, this is really important to us. How do I make sure that we control it? I think Greenlanders have been unequivocal in saying it's Greenlanders who are going to decide on their future, not President Trump.
They have indeed. Last 30 seconds to you. Would it have an impact on us if the United States took over Greenland?
Well, I think it certainly would. I mean, we have cooperative agreements that aren't well known. And in fact, for example, with mining, that we have the simulators to teach people how to run the big machinery, because you don't want somebody to take a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment and try and learn on it and potentially crash it. And on their side, they have actual mines that our people can go over and get trained on. And then, as the Premier was mentioning earlier, they're the familiar ties, which are very important. So there's lots of levels at which we have connection now. And we've worked very closely with Denmark, Greenland, in delineating our continental shelf in other law of the sea areas. So yes, if leadership changed there, it would have a big impact on us.
Stay tuned, everybody. Mr. Director, can I get a 3-shot, please, so I can thank our guests? Elizabeth Riddell-Dixon from Western University, Whitney Lackenbauer from Trent University, and R.J. Simpson, the Premier of the Northwest Territories. It's really good of the three of you to come on to TVO tonight and help us understand this issue so much better. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, January 28th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, it's official. Premier Doug Ford will call the election, sending Ontarians to the polls February 27th. We kick off our election programming with a look at day one of the race, plus a feature interview with one of Mr. Ford's most implacable competitors, Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie. Hope you'll join us for all of that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Always looking for more about what's going on at Queen's Park? Nerd Out with Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath and the On Poly podcast. Fridays on the Agenda, anytime on tvo.org or the podcast platform of your choice.